Welcome to your e-learning on educational theory and simulation. We will consider what motivates adult learners, some of the theories behind adult learning, some of the theory behind simulation, and the process of learning by participation. We will then discuss topics for discussion in debriefing, such as non-technical skills.
The process of education is a complex series of interactions between two key components, the teacher and the learner. It would be easy to think that for education to be effective, all that is required is the delivery of teaching that is clear and of a high quality. But teaching is only one component of an educational encounter. If we have not considered how an individual learns best, what motivates them, or even what mood they are in, then we may not be able to provide optimal conditions for learning to take place. It may not be the first thing that springs to mind when we consider setting up learning opportunities, but are your learners comfortable is an important question to ask if we want them to be receptive to our teaching. If we begin with the bottom layer of Maslow's hierarchy, consider the space we are working in. How is the ambient temperature? If the room is too hot or too cold, will your learners be able to maintain their concentration? Have we figured in regular breaks for comfort, food and water? If we consider the question, what motivates us to learn, then the goals that motivate each of us to undertake learning are both varied and individual. Lieb offered a possible list of learner motivations, but this list may not be exhaustive. Some may be overt from the very nature of the training interaction, but some may require time and effort to explore with our learners. Simulation as an educational strategy sits as a bridge within the zone of proximal development. This concept was introduced by the psychologist Lev Vygotsky. It was seen as a way to describe the way a child follows adult example and gradually develops the ability to do certain tasks without help. The zone of proximal development sits between what a learner can do without help and what they can't do. It's an area of learning that occurs when a person requires the assistance of a facilitator with a higher skill set. The role of simulation education is to give the learner experiences within their zone of proximal development and thereby encourages their individual development until the teacher is no longer needed for that task. The use of simulation as a teaching modality is informed by two schools of educational theory. Constructivism, which seeks to build new learning on the base of the learner's existing knowledge. It acknowledges the effect of the mind and the mental processes on learning. Behaviorism, which relies on observable behaviours and as an individual response to a stimulus. Through positive and negative reinforcement, learning can come from operant conditioning.
The behavioural psychologist Skinner theorised that if a person is repeatedly exposed to a stimulus which evokes a response, either positive or negative, then this will condition the person's behaviour in a particular way. In his trials, he showed that if a mouse is introduced to a piece of cheese, but every time it touches the cheese it gets an electric shock, it will no longer eat the cheese. In this way, you can condition its behaviour. Pavlov's dog's conditioning experiments involved him ringing a bell every time the dogs were fed. He then noted that every time the bell was rang, the dogs would begin to salivate, which he again referred to as conditioning. Whilst these are related to experiments on animals and sound quite extreme, behaviourist learning theory states that this idea of conditioning can be transferred to learning and that learners can be conditioned using positive rewards or negative consequences depending on their behaviour. This is often referred to as carrot and stick, where learners are given rewards or punishments, such as failing or passing, to motivate them to learn and reach a certain standard.
Simulation allows the repetition of an event to increase knowledge acquisition and automated response formation. Simulation in the form of basic life support training regularly teaches students how to deal with a cardiac arrest by repeatedly practicing scenarios. If a student performs well, then they will pass the course criteria and they are rewarded with a certificate of competence. This follows the behaviourist theory in the fact that behaviours which are rewarded are repeated. This was noted by Skinner right back in 1938. In constructivism, an important aspect of guiding development is an understanding of the existing knowledge of your candidates. This will form the base on which we build new learning. So first, you should ascertain and activate prior knowledge. Get your candidates to explain what they know, show what they can do so far. Then you can encourage them to build on and challenge their existing knowledge, but don't tell them what they already know. Make an effort to stress the clinical context and the situation. Explore, why am I doing it? What could go wrong? Try to use a variety of active learning techniques to engage your learners. Get them to read, to discuss, and to problem solve. And finally, give your learners responsibility for their own learning. Don't be afraid to give them homework. Simulation is an experiential learning tool. If we map Kolb's cycle onto the simulation experience, then the scenario forms a concrete experience for the candidates. The debrief will then allow them to reflect deeply on the experience and to precipitate greater understanding. The potential for behavioural change through abstract conceptualisation. In subsequent scenarios, the candidates will actively experiment with their new knowledge, and so the cycle rolls on. Experiential learning is not a new thing. In ancient Greece, Sophocles stated, "One must learn by doing the thing, for though you think you know it, you have no certainty until you try." We have explored the idea that what we hope to teach does not always equate with what our candidates learn, but we should perhaps spare a thought for the potential learning of lessons that we had not intended, what might be described as hidden teaching. Your candidates are like sponges, soaking up experiences, and they will learn when you least expect it. This may be in the form of the transmission of norms and values. Behaviours may be observed and emulated, whether those behaviours are intended or not.
We have now spoken about learning theory and how this relates to simulation as a method of experiential learning. We are now going to spend some time talking about topics to explore when debriefing simulation. A key learning outcome and frequent discussion topic is non-technical skills. Non-technical skills in healthcare relates to skills and behaviours that aren't clinical in nature, but are equally important for patient management and outcomes. Several models exist within different healthcare specialities, generally grouped into leadership, situation monitoring, mutual support, and communication. These are often interlinked in scenarios and feed into one another. Simulation is an ideal model for exploring not just the ability to perform clinical skills, such as performing an A/E assessment of a patient, but to explore how non-technical skills contribute to the management of a patient and the outcome of a scenario, and this is often a learning outcome of simulation. It is good to have a thorough understanding of these non-technical skills, as they will often come up in debrief discussion as areas for insight and improvement, so we will go through these in turn. Considering communication, there is often a lot to be discussed in debrief in terms of non-verbal communication. As shown above, a lot of what is communicated comes from vocal tone and positioning. This can be relevant for how learners position themselves when talking to a patient, for example, whether they're standing over them on the bed, whether they choose to get a chair, and how appropriate this is given the conversation taking place. It can also relate to how they position themselves and their vocal tone when talking to other colleagues. In terms of communications and team working, there will often be times in simulation where information is lost during team conversations, tasks will not get done as instructed, or different members of the team will have different ideas about what is going on during the scenario. It is important to discuss why this happened in debrief and to explore techniques for good team communication in practice and techniques for communication that leads to a shared mental model, such as sharing thoughts aloud and having team huddles. In terms of clear delegation, clinicians will often give instructions to the team in general, instead of a specific individual. For example, we need to give adrenaline. As the clinician has not given this task to a specific member of the team, this will often not get done, or several members of the team will all try to do this task. Teaching can be given here about giving direct instructions and making sure to check back and use closed loop communication. One technique for doing this is called closing the loop. It involves the instructor giving the instruction and asking the receiver to tell them once they have done it. The receiver clarifies the instruction, the instructor confirms, and then the receiver says what they have done. For example, the sender will say, "John, I need you to give 1 milligram of IV adrenaline now and tell me when you have administered it." The receiver will say, "So you want me to give 1 milligram of IV adrenaline now, is that correct?" The sender will say, "Yes, John, please give 1 milligram of IV adrenaline." The receiver will say, "I am now giving 1 milligram of IV adrenaline. The 1 milligram of adrenaline has now been administered to the patient at 10 a.m. The sender will then say, "Thank you, John. The patient has had 1 milligram of IV adrenaline at 10 a.m.
Another tool that is often helpful to guide communication is the A/E of communication. Accuracy is about ensuring that the information you give is correct, for example, patient details and up-to-date observations. Brevity refers to delivering the information in a concise manner and getting to the point. Clarity is ensuring that you use clear, simple language and avoid jargon. Demanding attention means ensuring that you are being heard and the urgency of the situation is conveyed. Empathy refers to trying to understand the emotional drivers that underpin motivation and action in others during potentially difficult conversations.
Situational awareness refers to the learner's perception of the situation around them throughout the scenario. There are a few ways in which situational awareness can fall down. When the learner doesn't correctly understand what is going on around them, isn't aware of developments, for example a sudden fall in BP, and doesn't anticipate what may happen as a result. This can be due to lack of clinical knowledge, but is often due to other issues. Some examples are that learners may not keep each other up to date throughout the scenario when they've had conversations with other members of the team, if they've not let the team know about information they've received, if learners aren't sharing their mental models with each other, or there may be distractions, and there may be times when not all staff members can see what's going on, for example if a monitor is out of sight. Another issue can be task fixation. An example of this is if a learner is trying to intubate a patient during an arrest. It is important that they are focused on the task and giving it their full attention. However, if the learner becomes task fixated, this means they lose awareness of the situation around them. In this case, they may lose awareness of the cardiac arrest and keep trying to intubate the patient when there should be other priorities. In debrief, it can be useful to discuss ways around this for the learners and how to break people out of task fixation safely. A well-known example of task fixation that led to a disastrous outcome was the Elaine Bromley case. A link to this video is provided in the faculty course resource folder if you have not heard about it before. We recommend that you watch it. Good leadership is another non-technical skill which may come up in debrief. Things to discuss can include whether there was a leader allocated in the scenario and how they were allocated. We often see in scenarios with the same peer group a reluctance to take on the leadership role, as they are used to this being dictated by seniority. In this case, we discuss around reframing leader as coordinator, as this can be less intimidating and doesn't imply that the person is the most clinically experienced. You can also discuss where the leader places themselves in the scenario physically, referring to the ALS idea of standing at the end of the bed to keep a helicopter view of the situation, and whether the leader felt they were able to do this, and if not, what the barriers were. Other aspects of leadership can be discussed in terms of delegation, which has already been discussed, coordination, and checking back with the team and ensuring a shared mental model. Another thing that can be discussed is whether the team had regular huddles to keep everyone up to date of the situation. When things have gone wrong in a simulation or an error has been made, it can be useful to have a brief understanding of System 1 and System 2 thinking when discussing what went wrong with the learners. It was described by Daniel Kahneman in his 2011 book Thinking Fast and Slow, where he describes how we have two ways of thinking. We use System 1 thinking for tasks we perform often, and people often describe this as feeling like autopilot. An example is arriving at work in your car and not remembering anything about the journey or how you got there. This method of thinking is when we are most prone to making errors, such as slips or lapses, or mixing things up. System 2 thinking is when we are performing less familiar tasks. We are thinking slow then, as we are really having to concentrate on each step of the task we're performing, and in this way we're a lot less likely to make slips or lapses or mix things up. This can be useful for learners to understand in their reflection, as they may often be frustrated with themselves for making errors this way and feel embarrassed, but giving them insight into this can help them understand the psychology behind thinking in this way. In summary, we have discussed adult learning theory and how this underpins the theory of simulation. We have also spoken about topics to discuss in debrief, including non-technical skills. There is more information regarding both of these topics in the recommended reading section, should you wish to read on it further.